Okay. Thanks, Paul. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, the first thing, I'd really like to thank you for the invitation to speak to you here today. It's a little bit daunting to look out at quite as many faces. I'm a little bit worried as to whether you'll be able to understand the Irish accent. So if anybody is having problems in terms of understanding me, or if I'm talking too fast, would you stick up your hand so I can adjust? But just to tune you in, I won't tell an Irish joke, but instead I'll tell you about a real life event. You won't believe it, but this has actually happened. 1978, Mitchelstown were the largest dairy company in Ireland, and new chief executive went in to meet the board, all 88, that's all the 8 board members, and there was an item on the agenda about quality milk, and one of the board members called Johnny from under the Galtee Mountain stood up, and Johnny was extremely cross. He was only a small farmer. He was after making a big investment, a heavy commitment, and what did Mitchelstown do? Each month he was graded, never got the top price. So Johnny was very cross. Chief executive, impressed by this big investment, heavy commitment, but also wanting to move on the agenda, said to Johnny that he'd ask the Mitchelstown quality control guy to go out onto the farm to see could he give him any good advice. So after the meeting, the chief exec met the quality control guy, asked him to go out, and 2 days later he met. He followed up and he asked Donald Cregan, the quality control guy, had he been out to Johnny's farm? He had. Had he been able to give him any good advice? Really superb advice. Problem solving advice. What was that advice? Shoot both cows. And that is a true story. Okay, so I'm going to suggest today that the world reached a tipping point in the last 18 months, and we'll say that a tipping point, and it's not, and it will not reverse. And basically, I'm going to suggest that cheap food is history, and that cheap energy, cheap grain prices are history. And on account of that, we'll say that we've entered a substantially changed outlook for dairy farming. And in terms of getting the impact, we'll say that the relative impact, and it's the relative impact I'm talking about now, 90% of the world's dairying is confinement dairying. We'll say that confinement dairying, where all material is brought to the cows, and the dung from the cows is stored and then brought out. So think of a situation as compared to a typical New Zealand dairy farm, where the cow goes out to the paddock and spreads her dung, as compared to the 90% of farms, high cost places where all food now is brought to the cows. And think of the amounts of relative energy that are used. There's yonks more energy used where all material is carted to and from, as in comparison to the dairy cow doing the work herself. And the second one, in terms of food prices, in particular grain prices, think of it that, for example, an American confinement farm in California, Arizona, wherever it may be, fairly typically feeding 3,500 to 4,000 kgs of grain, as compared to a New Zealand farm, many of them not feeding any grain, and even farms feeding grain, feeding comparatively small lots. The effects of grain doubling in price, who is it going to hit hardest? And certainly I would accept that costs have gone up, and even gone up a fair bit in New Zealand, particularly in fertiliser. That's also the case for confinement dairy farms, but their relative costs in terms of the things they really spend money on have just yonked up far, far more relatively. So the competitive advantage of grass-based dairy farming, whether in Ireland or New Zealand, has been substantially enhanced. And the impact of, we'll say, the much higher cost base now in confinement dairying is that for the world to actually feed itself with milk and milk products, that the average price for commodity milk will have to be at a level that is substantially higher on average going forward than it was before 2006. I'm not suggesting, we'll say, that there won't be blips or anything else like that in volatility. That will certainly happen. But I am suggesting a very strong outlook for dairy farmers. So very good for dairy farmers. But in terms of the effect on the human race, I'm actually going to suggest that the 21st century will be characterized by an enormous struggle in terms of resource shortages, extreme want and famine, and wars will be fought over resources, I would suggest, and we'll say that, and social disturbance and terrorism and whatever, will say that will have a far more fertile breeding ground than anything we've been used to up to now. So a very mixed picture, great for dairy farmers, not good for humanity. And the wild card, we'll say, is innovation, and hopefully we'll say there will be major innovations which will actually result in what I'm suggesting here today will actually not happen in practice. I would love to be proved wrong on that in terms of effects on humanity. Why should you listen to somebody like myself on this? I don't know how many people noticed that Peter Brabeck, the chairman of Nestle, the world's biggest and the world's best food company, in the last 2 weeks, he suggested the obsession, I'm using the word obsession, he didn't, I'm only paraphrasing now what he said, the fixation on global warming, he suggested, on something that was a danger to humanity decades out, difficult to measure, impossible to quantify its effects, is extremely misplaced in comparison to the real and imminent danger facing the global population in terms of starvation on a major scale, driven more by water shortages, particularly in India, than anything else. So let's move on a wee bit and just think of, so that's an overall summary. So in terms of, we'll say that, is food actually dear right at the moment? And given, we'll say that, I mean, since I wrote this paper 3 months ago, the news has been, in Ireland anyways, full of food shortages, food prices, etc., and food prices going up. But if you actually look at the Morgan Stanley index of food commodity prices over 100 years and more, food is not expensive at the moment in historical terms. Absolutely not expensive. In the 50 years from 1956 to 2006, food prices in real terms declined by 75%. And particularly in the last 20 years of that period, food prices going down, many times going down 1 to 2% a year, sort of the trend. That was the exception. That was the abnormality. Not, we'll say, where food prices are at this point. Because food prices at this stage are pretty cheap by historical standards, and I would suggest in real terms that food prices are likely over time to beat inflation. We'll go up and down in a bit of jerks, we'll say, but over time I would expect food prices to beat inflation going forward. So if I'm suggesting that cheap energy and cheap grain, we'll say that, expensive energy and expensive grain are some of the main reasons for this. Let's look at these individually. And go to the first slide, please, Paul. It's not that clear a slide, but what I want you to take from it is, we'll say that from 2.5 million years ago, that for many centuries, millions of years, the world's population had just grew at an extremely slow rate. And then we'll say at 1900, just over 100 years ago, world population had not even cracked 1 billion. Since that period, we'll say, the world's population has just exploded. 6.7 billion now, predicted to be over 9 billion by 2050. What has actually driven that? The remarkable transformation. And I would actually suggest that around 1900, cheap energy in the form of very cheap, flexible oil became available for the first time in available globally. And it was that, we'll say, which led to cheap oil, cheap energy, led to cheap mechanisation, it led to cheap fertiliser, it led to cheap irrigation, which has driven an explosion in food, which has allowed the world population to absolutely race away over the last 100 years or so. And is it likely that this kind of trend can carry on? I would actually suggest, we'll say, that in the context of history, the explosion of population over the last 100 years is pretty well an abnormality.
And I'll just jump on. Sorry, I'm going to pull the mic. Can you just do the mic away a bit?
Yeah.
Just try that.
Okay. Everybody able to hear? Up a bit. Okay, can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay. Sorry about that. It's is cheap energy history, and actually researching this was quite frustrating, because we'll say that one would have thought that this was a relatively straightforward subject, and I've only put down a tiny amount in the paper. But if I was to sum it up, we'll say that go back to the old laws of supply and demand. What is actually driving the price? Over the last 2 or 3 years, supply is actually only increasing by 0.25% per year, and demand is actually increasing at 1 to 2% a year. So naturally the gap between supply and demand is closing very rapidly, and that's what has driven price up. What's likely to happen for the future? You hear some people say peak oil has already happened and whatever. OPEC, certainly a vested interest, would argue, will say that the stocks of oil in the ground, will say that of what's supposed to be proven reserves is 3 times higher now than it was 25 years ago. Perhaps a more independent and objective sort of view is the International Energy Agency, and they're actually suggesting that given the much higher price for oil now, which is translating into a much higher exploration budget, that the supply of oil will actually grow from its present levels of 86 million barrels of oil per day to 130 million barrels of oil per day by 2030, which sounds good. Unfortunately, expected demand is actually growing faster. So we'll say their conclusion is, we'll say that cheap energy is history. There may be the odd blip up and down, we'll say, but the trend is upwards. And even what we might consider expensive energy now might look relatively cheap in 10 or 15 years' time. So let's have a look, we'll say, that in terms of the second part of the argument, is cheap grain history. And I strongly believe it is. When you hear of, we'll say, that 2007, in terms of grain production, you might hear, we'll say, about an Australian drought, or we'll say that in parts of the centre of Europe, we'll say, the grain crops were very poor. That is a normal occurrence, we'll say. There are always blips, we'll say, worldwide, and you have to look at the bigger picture. And in 2007, the world grew a record grain crop, the biggest on record. And what happened? For the 7th year in a row, stocks fell. So for 7 years in a row, the world has not produced as much as it's eating, and the difference being stocks falling are making up the balance. Measured in absolute terms, grain stocks are at their lowest level on average for about 60 years, and the second great staple of the human race is rice. And very quickly on rice, you could just sum it up, and it's the same trend. Rice stocks are falling, and you would be aware of, we'll say, that various countries, will say, reacting to this, who banned exports of grain or banned exports of rice in the last number of years. So, just in terms of looking at commodities globally, we'll say, the old law of supply and demand kicks into effect. Have a shortage, up goes prices. Have a surplus, down go prices. But generally, in terms of commodity cycles, they're also very related to economic growth. And commodity cycles are actually, in general, are quite long, we'll say. Often, historically, 15 to 25 years, an up market followed by a down market of something like the same length is pretty typical. From 73-74, the world entered a down market in terms of commodities, and it stayed down until the late 90s, and then hard commodities now, such as metals, oils, silver, gold, all these kind of things, gradually began to come into a shortage type situation with price racing up. In 2005, sugar, followed by grain, then followed by milk, with beef probably just getting there at this stage. The soft commodities have gradually entered the up market for commodities generally. And if it's typical of a normal cycle, then that is likely to carry on, we'll say, for perhaps 10, 15, 20 years. So what's happening? Why are commodities, we'll say, that going up? Why shortages at this point? And the reason is very simple. It's actually driven by very, very strong economic growth. From 04, 05, 06, 07 in particular, the world is growing faster than it has grown for more than 35 years. World economies have been growing about 4.75% a year. Tremendously strong growth worldwide. Even with some of the Western world, the US and parts of the EU and various others, close to a recession or very slow growth at the moment. Asian growth is still driving things, so it's expected to be around 3.8% this year and next year, which is still historically very high growth. And this growth, it's driven principally by the growth in hugely populated countries, like zero in particularly on China and India. 2.4 billion people between them, nearly 40% of the world's population. And when big economies like that grow quickly, it creates a huge demand for stuffs now, materials of all kinds. Just we'll say maybe to zero in just for a bit on China, because what's happening in China right at the moment is unprecedented in world economic history. China is growing at a rate and is changing at a rate which we have never seen now in world economic history. It's averaging close to 10% growth for the last 20 years, and is in the middle of a process of settling 500 million people from the country to either new or expanded cities. Break that down, and it's about 25 million people a year on average. About 2 to 2.5 million, 2 to 2.5 Londons a year are actually being constructed by the Chinese every year. It is just phenomenal. Is this growth likely to continue? The Communist Party has raised expectations, we'll say, in China, and will say to meet those expectations, it has to continue to industrialize, urbanize, because it's only as people move into the cities that their living standards is rising quickly. And there are 700 million people plus in the country who are still largely living in a peasant state. So we'll say that the Chinese government has no choice if it wants to hang on to power but to drive for economic growth. It's an interesting story. So that's the background to what's driving the demand for grain. So let's look and break that down a wee bit in a bit more detail. Is demand for grain growing? Is it growing strongly, and why is it growing? So that's where we're coming to now. And I'm going to argue we're in the very early stages of a huge structural increase in the demand for grain, and that this will be a strong and sustained trend over many years. And there are three main drivers. So Quick, next slide, please, Frank. The first slide there, if you look, we'll say that 1950, 2.5 billion people, 2000, 6.1, 2050, 9.2 forecast. Just to get some idea of what that actually means, phenomenal growth. The population of New Zealand is 4.2 million. Could anybody have a hazard a guess? Throw up a hand if I mention a figure. How long before the world's population increases by the New Zealand population? 6 months? 3 months? 2 months? 1 month? The answer, 3 weeks. Every 3 weeks, New Zealand's population is there's the equivalent to New Zealand's population in terms of extra people on this planet. And probably just to mention one country, we'll say India. About 1,100 million people at the minute, but it's growing by about 12 million people a year, 3 times New Zealand's population. It's quite phenomenal. So that's the first driver. We'll say that more mouths. And secondly, if you look over at the right-hand column, we'll say broadly, you have only a limited amount of land to feed them. So in 1950, a half hectare per person, 2000 a quarter hectare, and 2050 a sixth of a hectare. So that is one of the challenges. More mouths to feed and a pretty fixed supply of land. With the next one, please. The second one now is the increasing wealth effect, driven by very strong economic growth. Up on the top line there is call it the West. And calories are increasing, even though they may not, perhaps they shouldn't be. Think of obese Americans and whatever. And the yellow line are sort of the emerging countries, with the green line developing countries. And in the case of countries, we'll say that the relatively poor countries, as they get more prosperous, people, first of all, eat more. But secondly, eating habits change, particularly as people urbanise. And what actually happens is as people, very poor economies tend to eat things like grain, and as people and economies get more prosperous, there's a lot more meat fed. For example, the Chinese, in 25 years, have gone from 20 kgs of meat per person to 50. More than doubled. In the case of milk, just to hit the Chinese again, in 5 or 6 years, Chinese milk consumption from a low base has trebled. So big change. Once people start to eat meat and milk, that's food that is produced via an animal, then it's much less efficient in grain terms. What I mean is, feed 1 kg of grain to a person, they get 1 kg of feed. Feed 1 kg of chicken, it takes 2 kgs of grain to do it. Pork, 3 to 4 kgs for 1 kg of pork. Beef, 6 to 8. So it's less efficient and it's more demanding on grain. So extra grain, not fed to animals, so not fed to people, but fed to animals. And on the right-hand side, you could start to see in the period from the early 80s to 2006, over 23 or 24 years, you'll see the upper line in the case of Brazil. That's how much they feed now. 25 years ago, they were feeding, meat consumption and whatever was very low. Again, India and China, very strong increases in the upper line. The EU and the US, relatively little change, because we'll say that the populations were affluent, 25 years ago, and that change reflects, we'll say that it's estimated that in that, from that 25-year period, it's estimated that there's between 200 and 250 million tons extra grain fed to animals to feed humans, as compared, over that period. So that's been a strong, that has strongly enhanced the demand for grain. And the third driver, and this is where we'll say that that as a land use, you could say the petrol pumps are now competing with the supermarket, and prime land is now being used, we'll say, to grow ethanol or biofuels. And just as an example, in the States, in 1999, we'll say that about 1 billion bushels of corn going into for ethanol use. Now we'll say that about 5.5 billion. So a 5.5-fold increase in 7 or 8 years. And is that the end of the story? The next slide, please. If you look, we'll say that this is 05, we'll say, so the States has actually increased a bit. It's probably 4 or 5% now of fuel consumption, but its target is to go to 20%. So we're in the early stages of this move to biofuels, ethanol and so on. Brazil is the only one there that's even remotely close to its target, and that's because we'll say that they're producing ethanol from sugarcane, which is actually pretty efficient, whereas we'll say that producing ethanol from the likes of corn is pretty inefficient in terms of energy use. You could see that China hasn't really made a start yet, and in fact I don't believe that China has the resources to do it, and the EU the very early stage. So there's a long, the political will is still there to carry on growing fuel crops, we'll say, on prime land at the expense of food crops. There is no diminution of the political will, and the two American presidential candidates have given no indication as yet of reversing, and it is most unlikely that they will reverse. Issues of energy security are a major factor now, we'll say, that in the States and in Europe. So will it change? I doubt it. So a major shift is taking place in land use. It's occurring at a absolutely phenomenal pace. So are there other things? Are there other food, major food areas that can give relief? Fish, for example. And again, the answer is no. We'll say that because fish, the stocks by 2050, all forecasts will say that they'll be substantially depleted. So no relief there. So very strong demand. And if we look now at the other side on this, the very strong growth in demand of grain, is that going to be met by the supply of grain? So let's have a look at that one. And between 1950 and 1990, a 40-year period, grain production rose by 2.1% a year. Don't worry about the exact figures. So grew by 2.1%. The 15 years after that, that grain production rose by roughly half that figure. What is the restriction? Why is this happening? Any guesses? Yeah, somebody said water. And water, for the first time, is beginning to kick in. It's beginning to kick in. It has kicked in recent years, but it is going to kick in, and I'm going to cover later in the paper, so that water is going to be an enormous influence in this area on any possible increase in grain production. So let's look at the principal grain exporters. The US, by far the biggest. Anybody drive along the grain belt? You probably go 12 or 1300 miles, and it's wall-to-wall grain, absolutely prime land. Is the US likely to be able to grow a lot more? In that area, they're drawing from the Ogallala aquifer, which would have been considered so big that it would be impossible to actually affect. That was before 150,000 pumps kicked in, 150,000 pumps sucking from it. Big and all as it is, it's starting to go down. So generally the view is, we'll say, that the US will do well to meet the increased demand from the increase in population. It grows at 4 or 5 million a year, the US does. So very little relief directly on that one. There is a possibility that the 39 million acres that are held in set-aside, conservation reserve, farmers paid not to grow grain, that may well be released. But if it's released, all the indications are it will be released just for ethanol use. So it won't be available to grow grain for export, which is where it's going to be desperately needed. The next biggest two are Australia and Canada, and once Australian yields adjust back, we'll say, to normal, a non-drought type year, then it's not because both of them are pretty dry land states, it's not expected there'll be any great change. The EU will say no material change. They've allowed back 10 million acres where farmers were paid not to grow grain. That's back in production this year, but that's only a drop in the bucket. The Argentine and Brazil, possibilities there, we'll say, except the Argentine, fantastic land, but incredibly bad government, we'll say. So a major barrier, we'll say, stupidity of government, where they're more interested in keeping food prices down to actually have cheap food to buy the next election from Buenos Aires and the townies. That's their priority, not actually enhancing, not acting in the interests of Argentina as a whole. Brazil has possibilities. It's doubled its production, and it's forecast to double its production of crops in the next 10 years or so, but most of it will be in ethanol from sugarcane. So unless we'll say that Brazil really whacks into the rainforests, it's chopping down about 1.7 million hectares a year, unless it actually takes a lot more land from the rainforest, which has its own consequence. Unless that happens, Brazil is probably not a major answer. There are other ones, such as we'll say that probably the one we'll say that is easiest to ramp up production is Russia. When communism, the USSR collapsed in 1989-90, there was 120 million hectares. That's now 80 million hectares, 2/3. And even the production of that 80 million hectares is far less, because we'll say that fertilizer usage has been halved. So this is an area where there could be substantially more grain that could really meet the increased demand. But the question is this likely to happen in Russia? And they are probably not from the Russians themselves. And unless a lot of people feel happy to invest in Russia, and I have some Irish friends and some New Zealand friends who are actually prepared to do it, but I think the majority of people will actually shy off. The Russians are very keen to see investment flowing into their country. They're bloody unhappy at seeing profits flying out of the country, and it's probably not the safest spot to invest. Kazakhstan, the Congo, and Sudan, they're other areas that have potential, but the infrastructure is so appalling that it will probably take decades to actually develop it, unless the Chinese go in a big way, and there's some signs that that's starting to happen. Just on a more general note, an interesting figure is, we'll say, that how much land does agriculture lose out of agriculture each year due to development and due to desertification. Interesting figure. Doesn't sound much. 0.4% per year. That's 5 to 8 million hectares per year. Doesn't sound much, but 0.4% a year is 4% over 10 years. So it's quite significant over time. And maybe the most dramatic example of that is if you actually look at China. Between 1975 and 2006, 31 years, a flea bite now in history, China lost about 25% of its agricultural land to the growth of the Gobi Desert. They think they have it under control now. They're losing about 1 million acres a year. But there are other areas, Australia, parts of Africa, are some of the more obvious ones, where climate change is likely to lead to a faster rate of desertification. So the general gist, we'll say, from what I'm saying, is that the exporting nations are unlikely to be able to meet, to grow their supply of grain enough to meet the demand of the importing nations.